And to the extent that I have been able to communicate with people inside Iran, I think mm, still a significant majority are opposed to the regime. And despite all of this death and destruction, they, I think, are still welcome an opportunity for the collapse of this regime.
Even
Uh,
though there seems to be no clear path as to what the alternative will be.
Correct, correct.
Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm going to start with what is becoming very clear to everybody, and that is there is no end in sight. I'm talking about the fact that the world economy is in a tailspin, and we here in India are facing the hard impacts of the Israel US war on Iran and Iran's retaliation. Through the fog of war, one thing has become very clear: the US and Israel underestimated Iran's ability to fight back and also did not seem to expect its strategy to make this a regional war and to make this regional war the world's problem. To understand the underpinnings of Iran's strategy, to understand the impact this will have on the region, and really to get a sense of what Iranians want, Iranians who are on the front line of this devastating war and who are paying the price with deaths, destruction, and devastation. What do they want? I'm going to try and find out from Professor Nader Habibi. He's the professor of practice in the economics of the Middle East at Brandeis University's Crown Center for Middle East Studies. He's joining me from Boston. Professor Nader, thank you for making time for this conversation.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
We are talking in a week which should have been a festive week. It's Nowruz, which we celebrate here in India as well, as the Parsi community does. It is also Eid, Eid ul Fitr, and we are talking about and witnessing a war that is killing people. We've got to start by talking about what Iranians are making of this war.
If it wasn't for these very difficult and painful circumstances, it would have been a very large festivity all over Iran, regardless of political ideology, attitude toward government. This is one common festivity that all Iranians share, the Nowruz, the start of the new year. But unfortunately, this year it is mixed with this very painful experience of the war that is underway currently with massive devastation on Iran, severe interruption of normal life. But it also comes after the painful experience of the protests that took place in Iran in January. There is these two very complex developments, one after the other, that have impacted the emotions, the experience of Iranians as we start the new year.
So, what is the sentiment amongst the diaspora, Professor Nadir? There was a lot of support for the protests that took place in December, January, and there are a lot of people who are hoping for regime change among the Iranian diaspora. Today, as the war is underway, and we see the fact that President Trump has changed his stance several times in the past 3 weeks and counting as to what the outcomes are likely to be. Are there mixed feelings?
Yes, it is really very complex, and there is a diversity of opinions. But the sentiment that I observed among majority of diaspora, and also I think majority in Iran, before the February 28 war started, was that there was resentment and anger towards the government for the way it responded to the protests. So one could say that there was this deep desire among majority of people for change in the perhaps some kind of change in the regime, and many people believed that because the protests were not successful and they were brutally suppressed, the only alternative was a military intervention by the United States. People, not everyone, but some people felt that this was an opening that could perhaps bring about change because after what happened in government's response to the protests, massive and even random killing of civilians with brute force, there was a sense of despair that no longer peaceful resistance is an option. And Iranians do not have the power, even though majority of people are unhappy with the regime, they don't have the power to fight. There is no tool in their hands. But then the war began, and now when people look back at what has happened in Iran, I sense among many Iranians in diaspora and even inside Iran that they are beginning to doubt whether this war can help Iran liberate itself, transition into democracy. So some people are questioning the possibility of a path towards democracy through this war. But still, you see many people in social media who are saying still we have no alternative, and perhaps the only opening that can come is if this current campaign results in significant weakening of the regime so that there could be another uprising. And this group, and I think many people in Iran are inspired by one leader outside the country, the son of former Shah, Reza Pahlavi, who has been outspoken in the past 3 months, proclaiming that the support that he received during the January protests gives him a legitimate mandate to be the leader of the opposition for transition to a new government and democracy.
We have been watching videos and we've been hearing reportage from Iran, which shows a lot of people actually protesting these attacks, protesting the strikes that have been carried out, especially the horrific strikes on civilians. We saw the Minab school that was attacked by an American missile. Those images, those videos, which seem to suggest that Iranians are in Iran are rallying around the regime against the attacks at this point of time, even if they have their grievances with the regime?
Okay, so before this war began, Iranian society was heavily polarized.
Hmm.
And that is the major challenge in Iran's political system. Based on various surveys, in my opinion, about 75%, 75 to 80% of the population are opposed to this regime very severely. And then you have a small minority of about 20% who are fully dedicated to the survival of this regime. Their own well-being is linked to the survival of the regime, and ideologically, and these are the still the religious people who identify with the ideology of Iranian regime, both in terms of its foreign policy of fighting imperialism, fighting Israel's operation of Palestinians, and in terms of religious ideology of devotion to an Islamic lifestyle. But on the other hand, the 80% are secular, and they argue that this ideological foreign policy has devastated Iran, and they are also opposed to the lifestyle cultural oppression, which is what they perceive about imposition of Islamic lifestyle and lack of political freedom. So that's this division, in my opinion, when this conflict began. Coming forward, the 20% who supported the government, I think, are still supportive. Among the 80%, what I sense is that uh, perhaps maybe 10 or 15% of them have had a change of heart. But still, you sense that many people blame the government for what is happening. They blame the government's refusal to be flexible and make concessions in order to save the country. And they are silent because of the fear of repression and severe punishment. But when you see what they manage to post in social media, and to the extent that I have been able to communicate with people inside Iran, I think mm, still a significant majority are opposed to the regime, and despite all of this death and destruction, they, I think, are still welcome an opportunity for the collapse of this regime.
Even
Uh,
though there seems to be no clear path as to what the alternative will be.
Correct,
That's
correct.
a risk you believe that many Iranians are willing to take at this point.
Correct. Some of them still believe that Reza Pahlavi can manage this transition and emerge as a leader that can mobilize people and with unity. But among them, and I think among majority of people in both camps, there is this fear that weakening of the government might bring the country to a point where it's militarily so weak that there might be ethnic uprisings or disintegration of the country. That is one of the concerns that people have. There is also this fear that all of these neighbors who have been targeted and all the major countries that have been impacted by the way the conflict has expanded might mobilize and join this conflict, and it will expand and cause further damage to Iran's infrastructure, to Iran's industries, which have long term consequences for the economy and will take many years to recover, even if Iran achieves economic stability.
Professor Nadir, these protests that broke out in December and January, I've heard you talk about it, and you've said that there is a political dimension to economic hardships that people were finding really overwhelming, isn't it? And this life for decades under sanctions has completely destroyed the kind of well-being of people in Iran. Can you give us a sense of
Sure.
what life has been for Iranians in the past decades under these crushing sanctions?
Of course, of course. So these sanctions, in one form or another, have been going on for more than 40 years,
Mm,
but they became very intense in the past 10 years. There was a small period of time after the nuclear agreement in 2015 when sanctions were reduced and the economy grew a little bit, conditions improved. But then, in his first term, President Trump withdrew from this
mm,
nuclear agreement and introduced maximum pressure sanctions, including financial sanctions. Then situation got worse. And as time continued and came forward, there was a little hope during the Biden presidency that perhaps there is some relief and there might be even negotiations and an end to the sanctions so that there would be some economic relief. But then, with two events, the situation deteriorated. First of all, Iran actively became involved in supporting Hamas and engaging with Israel after the October 7 Gaza war in 2023, and that intensified Israel's pressure on Iran. And Iranians were angry because so much resources were being devoted to that war, while the economic conditions were difficult inside the country. And then when President Trump returned, he increased the pressure again on Iran, uh, limited Iran's ability to sell oil or transfer money back into the country. All of that caused really more pressure on Iranians, unemployment, severe inflation, loss of value of the currency. So this was felt by people in all economic classes. I was in touch with people as government employees. I was communicating with business owners, and they were all in early 2025 complaining about difficult economic conditions and uncertainty, especially because there was this threat of military attack. And then in June, there was a military attack, and that created significant uncertainty about what will happen in the future because after 12 days it came to a stop, but there was no resolution. So, what happened that triggered these January attacks, I think, was a sense of despair
mm,
and feeling that this is going to be permanent, this conflict with Israel and uh, United States.
mm,
For a few days before the protests began, Iranian currency lost its value very rapidly. And surprisingly, the bazaris, the merchants in Iranian bazaar, came to the streets and called for the rally. And they are traditionally conservative. They don't take political positions. They just want to trade.
mm,
So when they initiated these protests, their objective was to pressure the government purely for economic reasons.
mm,
But then other people joined, intellectuals, university students, large groups of people joined these protests. And one of the reasons that they felt comfortable to come into the streets
mm,
was that uh, President Trump
mm.
said, if you come to the streets, I will support you and I will prevent the government from confronting you.
So, Professor Nader, in 2022, 23, we saw this, the big protests, a lot of women there, the Masha Amini, her death,
Yeah,
triggered these massive protests where we saw women come out and want to be free of repression, want to be free of the moral police and the moral policing that was happening. That was, it has that anger also got dovetailed into this, or were they two separate movements?
no, precisely, because these are building up. You have
Mm,
Iranian middle class who
mm,
came out in those protests primarily to protest cultural repression and political repression. A few years before that, there was another uprising. I think it was in 2019, 2020, which was for economic reasons.
mm,
And back then, it was primarily the lower classes. But these all built up on each other, because there was this accumulating sense of hopelessness about change in a situation where so many people felt that they could not really tolerate all these pressures anymore. And that's why I mentioned earlier that about 75 to 80% of the people are opposed to this regime because it is not responsive to any demands. Khamenei, before he was killed, he was completely indifferent to all these demands for reform, even from within the group of political elite of the Islamic regime. That elite is divided into hardcore conservatives affiliated with the Revolutionary Guards
mm,
and the sort of more liberal reformists affiliated with President Rouhani, former president, and current president Pezeshkian. So the people felt that there was really no way of creating change by negotiating with the regime. And then coming forward, they felt that even protests, mass protests, are futile because the regime is willing to use maximum violence. Uh, so this is why I'm saying still there is
mm,
opposition, despite the fact that people see what these attacks are doing to the economy, to infrastructure, even cultural
mm. Heritage sites.
monuments.
Mm,
Yes, Iran's historical cultural heritage has been damaged as well.
mm,
And the civilians that have been killed,
mm, mm.
unfortunately.
Professor Nader, let's take a look at Iran's strategy because after
Yes.
February 28th, we saw Iran not just target Israel, but also all the American bases in the neighboring Gulf countries. And it is interesting, and I have to quote President Trump saying that Iran, weren't supposed to go after all these other countries in the Middle East. Nobody expected that. We were shocked. He further said the greatest experts, nobody thought they were going to hit. Is this something that suggests that Iran's strategy was so unexpected, or is this President Trump being, economical with the truth?
Well, Iran was threatening to target the American bases. They repeatedly said that before the war started.
Mm,
However, many analysts in the West, and perhaps, as President Trump has said, some members of his advisors didn't think these threats were credible because they thought that since the US and Israel have such a formidable force and absolute military advantage over Iran, Iran would never dare to attack these targets. They also felt that they would have enough defensive weapons to prevent these by attacking any kind of Iran's capacity for such an attacks in the first 2 days of the war. So this was sort of a combination of miscalculation about Iran's ability and Iran's intention. Um, that's how we came to the current position because uh, even in January uprisings of the people, the regime felt that it was really faced with an existential threat. And they feel like they have no alternative but to fight. And if you think about what is going on in Iran currently, it is like a triangle. There are three groups involved. It's the Islamic regime, it's the Iranian people who are not affiliated with the regime, and the third axis is the Israel and United States. Islamic regime feels like it is confronting two enemies: the people of Iran
Yeah.
or the opposition, and this Israel and United States military threat. So they find it existential. And that's why they decided that we have no alternative but to, if this war begins, to fight it. Because surrender means the regime would collapse. They cannot compromise with the people. They are not able to accept any kind of compromise. But at least the hardcore IRGC revolutionary corps that are currently in power feel that there is no way that they can survive through a compromise, similar to what Pinochet did in Chile. Therefore, their only alternative is that they are surrounded and they will fight. Either they will survive or they would be destroyed in this war. So that is the basis of the strategy that they have chosen. And since they were preparing for this war for several years, we see that they have developed a number of weapons, including drones and missiles, that they are now using. And in order to increase economic pressure on President Trump, they have initiated the
Of
blockage
the
of the Hormuz Strait.
Given that we are 3 weeks into this war and counting, and as you have so clearly explained to us, that for the regime in Iran, it's an existential battle. It's do or die,
Yes.
literally. So, given this, where do you think this war is headed? And, what are the chances that this war will continue? I mean, at this point of time, it seems indefinite.
Correct, correct. So it's really very hard to predict, but there are a number of possibilities. Looking at what Israel is doing, Israel is not only targeting military infrastructure in Iran, but they are targeting security forces that uh, are the government is counting on to confront a potential uprising. For example, they use drones to attack the checkpoints on the streets. And Israel is hopeful that as they continue these, there comes a point when the people in Iran feel confident to rise. So, one scenario that we might see, I don't know what the probability is that these attacks might finally create a situation where there might be an uprising. Of course, that might result in internal civil war or it might result in the collapse of the regime. If that does not happen, then there are two possible scenarios. One is that Iran can continue these responses to Israeli and American attacks by both targeting Israel and targeting US military assets for several months. There would be low intensity, but they can replenish the drones and the small missiles and continue these attacks. And that's the scenario that it could be prolonged. And the problem with that is that that would be devastating for global economy in terms of disruption to the supply of natural gas, crude oil, and petrochemical products, including diesel and jet fuel, and many other petrochemical commodities. And then that can result in escalation of attacks on Iran, while the Iranian regime can respond with maximum devastation on Iranian economy, but also significant pain for global economy. And we don't know how that might finally come to an end until Iranian
Mm,
military assets are completely exhausted.
mm,
The other scenario is that realizing how costly this campaign is for the United States and for global economy, there might be some kind of negotiation and a ceasefire. Potential mediators for that are Russia with the support of China, in my opinion. Those have the most opportunity for uh, being trusted by Iran and also being able to mediate some kind of ceasefire. So either we might end up in a ceasefire, a prolonged conflict,
mm,
or really an uprising that might change the political equilibrium inside Iran.
mm,
But who knows how these might develop? I think the pressure on President Trump to end this war, or at least to contain it so that the Hormuz is open and some substantial amount of oil can flow again into the global markets, is high, and it's increasing.
mm.
And he is heading towards re-election, elections, and not
Yep.
his re-election, but
Mm.
midterm elections in the United States. So these are the potential scenarios that we are going to face.
We saw Iranian leader Ali Larijani, before he was killed, reach out to the Gulf countries, to the GCC countries especially, and talk about a common cause, a larger Islamic cause, and and asked them to speak up, to stop this,
Right.
to support Iran. Uh, that's not going to happen. That hasn't happened. That doesn't seem like it will happen. What do you How does one understand that?
The idea of Iran calling on these GCC countries to come forward with a new regional security arrangement is not new. This is an idea that Iran has proposed for many years.
Mm,
But of course, these countries for last 50 years have always been under U.S. military protection,
mm,
and they are unlikely to abandon that. They rely on U.S. for their security very strongly. So right now, what we see is that their attempt to remain neutral still holds, but as these attacks continue on the Gulf countries, we might see a change of strategy. They are still reluctant to openly join this war because that means they are siding with United States and Israel, and that is not popular in the Arab world. After the Gaza war and the devastation of the Palestinian territories that all Arabs have witnessed for the past 3 years. So they are in a difficult predicament at the same time. Their economies are very vulnerable. Tourism, attraction of foreign capital, foreign workers, they are all at risk. And already we see the impact on their
Dubai.
economies,
Mm,
correct? So, yes, it's a very difficult situation and hard to predict really how this is going to evolve. I still think among those three scenarios that I mentioned, perhaps some kind of negotiation might be has a higher probability because everybody is under pressure. Clearly, Iran is under severe pressure. The United States, European countries. So
mm.
there might be some negotiation.
Negotiated ceasefire at some point. You think that
Negotiated ceasefire, correct,
option?
but that requires really a few weeks of negotiation because the Iranian regime is reluctant to accept another half-baked
Yeah.
ceasefire because they fear that if they accept a just a temporary ceasefire, in 6 months there would be another episode. In 2 years, another episode, and
And
this will
Professor,
linger on and on.
what is the sentiment in America? Does this war have support within President Trump's base? You referred to the midterm elections that are coming up.
Correct. Various polls show that majority of people are opposed to what took place, at least as of now. Within the camp of Republicans and President Trump, there are those who are speaking out, criticizing it. We saw that some of the key officials in his cabinet resigned or might resign because they refused to say that Iran was an imminent threat to the United States. So he's facing some pushback, some opposition to this decision. There is still a core conservative group that support it, but I think the at least until the midterm election, it is unlikely that the Congress will take any action against him because in times of war, there is a tendency to simply make sure there isn't enough division to cause a damage to the unified stand of United States in foreign policy. And that's how it is often that a conflict starts and then there is pressure that we have to finish it and we cannot accept defeat and step out. So it gets prolonged, just like the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, that there was a strong opposition, but it lasted many years. So support is minimal, and there is a strong criticism that it was not based on substantial facts that a conflict was necessary. I think if this was a quick war and would have ended in favor of United States in maybe 2 or 3 days or 1 week, we would not have witnessed this so much growing opposition. Just as there was indifference when the United States carried
Last
out
year.
an operation in Venezuela and there wasn't much reaction at all. But now Americans are realizing its impact on the United States, and then they see the global impact, which affects the American prestige and standing in the world. Already, price of gasoline is rising. Price of natural gas is increasing in the United States. Um, the plans by the Federal Reserve to reduce the interest rates, which would have been helpful for the economy, are on hold because the Federal Reserve is now worried about rising interest rates, rising inflation. So these are being felt by Americans. Therefore, they are questioning why was it necessary to carry out this operation at this point.
Will this war that is being waged on Iran at this point of time, and the way Iran has blockaded the Strait of Hormuz, the way oil and LNG supplies for the rest of the world have been held hostage, is this going to have a long term impact on this region, which you've studied so closely, and the economics of this region?
Yes, and the reason I say yes is that if the damage to the region was simply blockade of the Hormuz, that could have been lifted and situation could have gone back to normal. But what we are witnessing now is that already there is damage to oil facilities and natural gas facilities. Those will take several months to repair at least. Qataris believe that the restoration of full export of liquefied natural gas will take several years. So, as far as the capacity to export oil, the region has been impacted severely. And it might go on. We don't know what would be the extent of additional damage to the region. Then comes the question of uh, confidence in the region, a return of tourism, and restoration of investment in the region. Because the region has been, especially the Gulf countries, have been very actively trying to attract foreign capital. Uh, Now, some investors would say if this conflict is not resolved, if there is a risk of another conflict like this in the future, we have to take that risk into account in our future long term planning for the region. One of the countries that had a strong potential for economic development was Iraq, given that it had a need for major developments and its oil production was up to nearly 5 million barrels per day. But because Iraq is also a divided society with some segments supporting Iran, already we see that this violence is spreading into Iraq with massive attacks on the Hashd al-Shaabi supporters of Iran and attacks on American embassy. So the prospects in Iraq are also at risk. So I would say the impact on the region will last for 1 or 2 years at the very least, and then slowly it can be restored. But that depends on how this conflict is resolved. If there is a regime changing in Iran, which does not destabilize Iran, and we see a new regime that is more cooperative with the conservative Arab countries of Persian Gulf, with United States, with Israel, then we might see more stability. Because then at least this front in the conflict might diminish. Or if there is a comprehensive uh, truce between Iran and the United States, some kind of negotiation, an agreement that promises more stability, then again we could see a positive scenario. But if there is an ongoing war of attrition or a fragile ceasefire, the entire region would be at risk because moving forward, everyone predicts that if there is an attack on Iran, the response would include targets in the GCC countries uh, and other parts of the Gulf and the Middle East. Therefore, there is always this high feeling of tension and risk in the region.
Professor Nader, thank you for spending time to explain this to our viewers. I really appreciate it, and all I can hope for is, an end to this war. The hardships that are being faced by people all over the world, at least people dependent on Iran and that region, and of course the people in Iran who are at the front
Yes,
line of this. Thank you very much for making time.
appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity and happy Nowruz to all the Iranians in India who might see this program, to the Parsis, others who celebrate Nowruz all around the world. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.